Suppose that suppose that we're trying to justify why we ought to believe in the truth conduciveness of things, for example, right? Suppose that that's the project that we're embarking on. And somebody says, okay, I have a hypothesis. Okay, what is it? The hypothesis is that the reason why we form true beliefs is because we were evolved to do so. Let's say somebody says that, right? So they give like some type of evolutionary account to explain the truth conduciveness seemingly of like our belief formation processes, for example, right? That just feels like a just so story, right? Reason being is because it already assumes in the theory that natural evolution or like evolutionary processes are themselves what produce those like norm following constructs, right? And so it's going to explain the epistemic normativity purely in terms of appealing to the behavior that we want to justify, as opposed to how as opposed to showing how the norms themselves are actually binding or are constitutive by the evolutionary facts, right? So in the same vein, it seems like what your theory is doing is that it's explaining the aesthetically real properties in terms of the behaviors that we have, as opposed to actually explaining why it's the case that those real properties are constitutive and causally efficacious, as opposed to just already assuming it in the theory, right? Which is kind of like what's giving me this impression of it being a just so story, right? Because it's not clear that there's any actual like independent motivation to accept that it is the case that there are such items like causally efficacious, mind independently real aesthetic properties. Like what's going to be the
The
sort of like
independent motivation.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, so I view this very similar to like if some action occurs by an agent, some subject actually. Um, and somebody says, well, why can't, the data of how this action occurred is entirely explained by the action, the causal, history therein. And it's like, kind of, but the intentional states explain the causal history in some non-causal way, if you will, or maybe in a causal way. That's sort of, you can be quiet on that. Or that moral properties, right, are not the type of thing that people are expressing in mere moral discourse, right? In the same way, I'm saying, like, look, there are these types of aesthetic properties because they do real explanatory work, right? They're doing and normative work in some cases, like conditionally, that aren't captured by just mere reference to the physical facts there. Like this normative thing is doing work, and how is it doing work? Well, uh, in the same way that positing somebody's intentional states in a court of law explains their sort of causal history, me positing some type of aesthetic property explains, right, the type of normative discourse that's norm governed
but that could but what I'm saying is that could equally be explained under the competing hypothesis.
nominalism.
No. Like the fact that what you just said is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that I'm understanding what you said just now is that um, when I when I when I see an object and I form a judgment about the object and I say, okay, well, this is like a desirable just take the ordinary like notion of value, right? Like when I try chocolate cake for the first time, I will form a judgment, right? It's either going to be that it tastes good to me or it doesn't taste good to me, or I just don't have an attitude towards the taste of it or something like that. Like those are the only three options that you have, right? Now, what I'm saying is that that formation, that judgment is going to be explained under a view where there are no such things as causally efficacious mind independent aesthetic properties. So like why would we need to posit that to explain the judgment?
Just saying, like, other views, like Hume's expressive stuff, and I've not read much about that with aesthetics, but like all those other views, whatever views are sort of relevant, have the ability to explain this, like they can accommodate it.
I'm saying that they equally explain the data. And so if they equally explain the data at like the same way that your view does, then it's not clear why we would posit these extra entities. Like what's the theoretical benefit?
Well, if you're just saying that, yeah, they do explain it equally, then yeah, there would be no benefit. But that's the debate, right? Whether or not mine explains it better than the other. I'm saying, like, well, I make the advocacy case, right? I would want to say something like Michael Huemer does in every debate, where it's like, well, these anti-realist explanations, fail to capture this like normative force that people have when they say something is beautiful and they're engaged in aesthetic discourse, right? It seems to just fail. It seems to just fail to capture the aesthetic practices that we have, so on and so forth, right? You can just levy objections to all those other views in such a way that Huemer does with his more realist view.
Sure. Well, I agree. So if you and I both agree that there's no theoretical advantage in postulating those additional entities to explain the explanandum, for example, then I mean we could just let's just suppose that we're going under. Let's suppose that we're going under like a ontological parsimony as like this theoretical virtue. In which case, right, like introducing additional entities into the theory is going to have a similar effect to basically introducing additional adjustable parameters into an equation, for example, right? Because for each proposition that you tack onto the theory, it's going to come with an additional set of suppositions about each additional entity, which themselves are fallible, right? Like we could just be mistaken about those postulations. So why would we increase our odds of being wrong about the aesthetic matter as opposed to just adopting the simpler hypothesis?
Well, I mean, hot take, but I don't think ontic parsimony is truth conducive.
Well, no, I'm not saying that it's truth conducive. I'm saying that it's probability conducive.
More likely the case than it is the case.
Yeah, it's more likely the case that aesthetic properties are mind dependent as opposed to them being mind independent.
Well, I would need the argument. That's just to say my view is false, right? Like I don't, or
No,
like
no, I'm not saying your view is false. I'm saying that your view is less likely, given the fact that you and I have both agreed that there's no theoretical benefits in postulating those additional entities.
well,
And
yeah.
so,
If you stipulate that like my view has the same explanatory power as every other view on offer, then just take the minimalist view. Like that just be the view you should take then. But
right. So then,
obviously,
mhm.
huh?
Right. So then we should take we shouldn't take the view where there are mind independent aesthetically real properties.
Well, conditionally, if all views on offer have equal explanatory power, then
Well,
you should take
I'm
the
not
view
saying all. I'm saying just this view has equal explanatory power.
with all other views.
So I'm saying there's two views I'm saying right now, right? So we tag the first one as quote unquote epiphenomenal hypothesis, and then we have, let's just call it the aesthetic realism hypothesis, right? So I'm saying that all of the data can be accounted for under the quote unquote epiphenomenal hypothesis, and it doesn't need to postulate any additional entities into the schema.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, I don't understand because I obviously wouldn't agree that we have equal explanatory power. But if that's stipulated, if that's just the conditional, then yeah, you should accept their view. Just mere fact that it has less postulates, that's fine. But
Oh,
the
wait.
debate.
So what do you think your view is explaining that isn't accounted for under the competing hypothesis?
Well, I think I've made a good abductive case thus far for what it's explaining. It's explaining the normative force, the norm governed practices. It's explaining like normative discourse. Like it just has better explanations and such that if my view were true, these things are expected and not just accommodated. If epiphenomenalism were true, those things are accommodated, not expected.
I'm not seeing how those are underdetermined under the alternative hypothesis. It seems like those things, like you can just explain those alone as a matter of the aesthetic properties being hyper intentionally grounded in virtue of intersubjective norms, right?
Well, no, because then if it's just hyper intentionally grounded through intersubjective norms, then it would be the case that you'd have a lot more agreement or a lot more consistent effort here. But clearly, even among the highest of academics in this relevant field, I don't know if you call them academics really, but seems to be substantive debate such that it's not intersubjectively the case. I don't think even remotely it's intersubjectively among the folk.
Yeah, but that's just an argument from disagreement, though. Like, just because, so you're saying that because there's a disagreement about the matter, that it's not the case that the facts about the
No.
matter are intersubjectively determined?
No, if the epiphenomenalist idea we're talking about